Archibald!
Just after 11 a.m., Blackwater's team, led by middle-aged former Navy SEAL named Chris White, caught an early lunch with CPA staff, a few Salvadorian soldiers, and 2 members from Bravo Company of Alabama National Guard's 711th Signal Battalion. One of those National Guardsmen, Specialist Michael Acquaviva, was installing communication networks at the base. Meanwhile, behind the CPA building, a small team of Marines had just finished wiring a base station radio in the Spanish Forces headquarters. Corporal Lonnie Young, a burly 25-year-old defense messaging system administrator from Dry Ridge, Kentucky, reckoned he had a few minutes before chow time, so the Marine climbed up into the back seat of his truck for a quick nap. Outside the front gates, Al-Sadr's crowd continued to demand freedom for Al Yaqubi. Then, around 11:25 a.m., a very different sound rang out from the road. Bursts of AK-47 fire echoed throughout the complex as bullets rattled off the concrete buildings. The protest was no longer peaceful, and instantly everyone was on the move. Blackwater's team rushed the CPA personnel out of the cafeteria and into their fortified section of the complex. The guards grabbed their body armor, whatever ammunition they could carry, and their government-issued weapons. Mostly, that meant M4 carbines, a descendant of the famous M16 assault rifle with a short barrel that makes it easy to handle on security details. But it's not something you choose to defend a compound with. Beyond about 1,000 feet, accuracy becomes a problem for the M4, especially with moving targets. And 1,000 feet doesn't feel like nearly enough space between you and an angry militia. A few of the carbines had attached M203s, single-shot, 40mm grenade launchers that could scatter the crowd, but they weren't especially practical at longer ranges either. As they gathered their gear, my men noticed Acquaviva had brought with him an M249 squad automatic weapon, SAW, a belt-fed, bipod-mounted light machine gun that can rip off 800 rounds per minute. The guardsmen heard reports of potential unrest in the area, Acquaviva said. Just in case, he packed a weapon perfect for long-range suppressive fire. It was strongly recommended the guardsmen come along, and the growing security team raced around the corner in a Humvee to the 2-story CPA building, picking up a few Salvadorian soldiers along the way. They headed for the roof. Soon Young, who had been jarred awake by sounds of gunfire, was roaring up the steps behind him, his own SAW in hand. 8 Blackwater men and a handful of coalition troops spread around the satellite dishes and ventilation systems on the CPA roof until they had a 360-degree view of the city. That roof was actually made up of 2 adjoining rooftops that met at a central reinforced tower that encased the stairwell. A short sand-colored wall ran along the perimeter, offering a protecting vantage point to monitor the gathering crowd. But there's no cover from above. The men remained vulnerable to surveillance from the hospital tower beyond, and as the Mahdi army overtook government installations in its march across the city that morning, Blackwater's men would soon learn they had also overrun the healthcare facility, turning a 450-bed hospital into a sniper's nest. Suddenly, more unrest in the street, and the sickening sound of an explosion. 4 Salvadorian soldiers rushed back into the compound, were mobbed outside the front gate. The men were ripped from their truck, beaten by the crowd. And then members of Al-Sadr's army reportedly forced a grenade into the mouth of one of the young Salvadorian soldiers and pulled the pin, Less than 1,500 feet from the coalition position, the protest had deteriorated into frenzy. Through his gun aperture, Young watched men spill out from the Mahi truck, then ran to shooting locations on the street below. They were clad in bright white robes, customary Iraqi burial dress. They had come to fight to the death. One of the Iraqis quickly dropped down into a prone position and fired several rounds at us. Young would later recount to a local newspaper interview, "I started yelling that I had a target in my sights, and I asked if I could engage. 'With your permission, sir, I have acquired a target,' he yelled again. 'With your permission, sir, I have acquired a target.'" But there was no commanding officer to answer his call. The 25-year-old communications specialist would later say that as the only American in uniform on his part of the rooftop, his first inclination upon bursting from the stairwell was to call out orders to the contractors around him. "But I realized real quick that these guys knew what they were doing," he said. "I was up there within 30 seconds of the first incoming shots. The Blackwater was already there. Binoculars out, weapons locked on, picked out targets. So instead of telling them what to do, I started working with them." It was a smart decision. Half the Blackwater men atop the CPA building that day were former Navy SEALs. The rest were veterans of other military and police special operations units. They formed by far the most highly trained team, civilian or military, of any nationality in Najaf. It also marked the first time in memory that private contractors commanded active U.S. military personnel in the midst of a firefight. End quote. That being the excerpt from book Civilian Warriors by Erik Prince. Now, persona aside, I remember when this happened. In fact, I'm a very young guy, right? And when I watched this being plastered on all the news sites, especially your common commie rags, I remember seeing the big picture on the screen. I was like less than 10 years old, and I saw these men fighting, and of course on the bottom, mercenaries in combat. I think I remember this. And for many, especially those around me, I don't, especially when you talk about it in years to come after that, when I had a little bit more sentience, it was more of a negative connotation. And indeed, to this day, if you look up and you Google Blackwater, it's almost synonymous with a black smear or something crazy like that. But I didn't see that. I didn't see that at all. And I think most Americans didn't see that at all. I think most Americans see what I saw. I think I saw Americans defending freedom, advancing our cause of justice. On top of everything else, when I saw the picture of those men on that rooftop, in mixed matched, of course, uniforms of different nationalities, as you saw Salvadorians and as you saw Americans as well, fighting side by side against a radical Islamist element, I didn't see mercenaries. I saw heroes, and indeed they were my heroes. In fact, in a lot of ways, I think it's the early GWOT Iraq War which inspired me to dedicate myself and a lot of my friends as a formative experience and a formative memory, and the experience of those by proxy, to dedicate ourselves to the soldiering warrior lifestyle of champion our country, but most importantly, championing the values that it holds, and also, of course, maybe a little bit more in particular, exploring the many different ways in which we can serve our country. Now, why is it that I bring this up? I think it's important when you read communist-controlled newspapers. They always slander patriotic people. And even if there are mistakes that may be made, and I think Erik Prince has always been the kind of guy that owns up to it. In fact, and I won't go into there because it's between him and God, but obviously he gets ahead of it in his book. He's always forthcoming with his mistakes. He always owns up to his faults, even if they weren't his fault per se. He takes extreme ownership of his command and everything that happens within his purview. But I remember, I think figuring large in my mind, and it's something that I've debated often, and I remember speaking with my dad about and how he disparaged this, but deriding Blackwater and associated types like Triple Canopy, as it was called, I don't know if it's continued thus far, or the various other private military security forces or private military contractors, smearing them as mercenaries. And nothing could be further from the truth. And I think it's really important to start this by explaining the difference and the delineation. And I know, Legionaries, it can be a little bit of, for you, a hair-splitting argument, but it's not. Especially in an age, for instance, we see in the Ukraine and Russia leveraging Wagner Group, and Wagner Group taking offensive military actions abroad, and both within the what they call the special military operation, clearly infringing on the Geneva Convention for what a mercenary, or rather what a private military contracting group is allowed to do. I think it's important that you understand how it is that Blackwater is not the mirror of Wagner Group. Why, right? So without further ado, let me just read here the actual definition straight from Civilian Warriors, and it's really important that you guys remember this for later. At its essence, mercenaryism is outlined by a pair of international conventions set in place to specify, criminalize, and eliminate the practice. 1977's Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions and the UN's 1989 International Convention against the Recruitment, Use, Financing, and Training of Mercenaries. Under Additional Protocol 1, there are 6 conditions to be satisfied. So 6 that have to be met to mean that you are a mercenary, right? For one to qualify as a mercenary. And the term applies if that person does A, is specifically recruited locally or abroad in order to fight in an armed conflict. B, does in fact take a direct part in the hostilities. C, is motivated to take part in the hostilities essentially by the desire for private gain, and in fact is promised by or on behalf of a party to the conflict material compensation substantially in excess of that promised or paid to combatants of similar ranks and functions in the armed forces of that party. D, is neither a national of a party to the conflict nor a resident of territory controlled by a party to that conflict. And then, of course, one second, E, is not a member of the armed forces of a party to the conflict, and F, has not been sent by a state which is not a party to the conflict on official duty as a member of its armed forces. So, okay, so why is it that Blackwater is not a mercenary group? Well, first of all, when it's recruited, it's not recruited to take direct offensive actions. If anything, it does security, right? At the most conventional element of its services, right? Private services, it does facility security. So, for instance, in Deir ez-Zor or in Syria, there are certain locations which have oil fields, or in Iraq or Afghanistan, whatever. There can be camps that are guarded by guards. Those guards can be private military contractors. But it's quite another thing to be using men in offensive operations. So, for instance, if you remember back, I think it was in 2016 or so, there was this attack on an outpost in Syria by Wagner forces on SOF, American SOF units operating inside of Syria, and effectively, obviously, they got completely blown out, but the use of them in an offensive manner was, I guess, a Geneva violation, right? And the Russians, they claim that obviously the United States has no business operating in Syria. The legitimate government of Syria, which is headed by Bashar al-Assad, has not given permission to the United States to operate in those air regions. So they are couching their argument that those Wagner Group forces were operating in a defensive posture and egressing to the principal, right? What they're called a principal, the place that they're trying to secure. So in a defensive manner, right? So it was defensive, but we all know it was offensive, and it was to try and knock off American forces who were in Syria. Either way, I'm not here to take sides. but I'm just trying to tell you the delineation. So B, of course, direct hostilities. So this means obviously an active role, aside from self-defense, which is completely different, right? Because if you're in the military, especially if you boys from soldiering background, you can take offensive operations. You can find, close with, and destroy the enemy. But that's not what PMSs and PMCs do, right? Security firms, what they do is usually get off the X. They egress and they protect the principal. They're not looking for a fight. In fact, they're not in a good position if they are getting in gun battles with whoever may be the assailants. The ideal is to, flight, right? Fight or flight, they're flight. And this is not because they're cowards. It's because, specifically speaking, that is the role that they're trying to take, and they're trying to defend an HVT, right? So now, is motivated to take part in hostilities essential by desire for private gain that is not measurable or not commensurate with similar forces in conventional forces and ranks in similar functions. So, what does this mean? So, are his men getting paid more that have the same experience, same function, same rank as a regular army or military force? And this is actually really important. Erik Prince makes an exceptional statement that effectively the average grunt, so to speak, or the average soldier, Marine, service member in Iraq was making, after benefits, roughly exactly the same, let's assume, right, exactly the same as a full-time contractor. But here's the added thing, is that he also says that full-time contractors don't exist, that they were hired and let go on contract. So that means, at a 1-month stint, they were doing a very specific job in a very specific function, and then, of course, their contract ended. So what does that mean? Their per annum, right, or their quarterly earnings were actually far to the inferior of a regular service member. Because, yes, service members maybe get a lesser amount out the gate, out the pocket, in their paychecks, but they're given free health benefits, free housing, a number of other services and benefits which amount to and usually are far superior to civilian contractors in a private military contracting capacity. So, of course, you can argue with that all you want. You can be wrong. I'm just not going to even engage with that. Obviously, I think that, again, Blackwater's already passed 3 of those metrics. So D is neither a national of a party to the conflict nor a resident of territory controlled by a party to the conflict. So what does this mean? So obviously, when they were in Iraq, it was a multinational coalition force. Not simply Americans, but Salvadorians, as you saw, Spaniards, Europeans of all kinds, Ukrainians, Mongolians even. I think I should post a couple pictures. It's actually really cool. But I think it's really important that you understand that mercenaries only arise when you are recruiting in a position where their nationality has nothing to do politically with the direct conflict being had. So, for instance, if Russia were to somehow leverage North Korean soldiers to fight on the Ukrainian front, that might be a flag, right? But again, Blackwater operators were hailing from countries obviously over-represented, or that in a good way, from the United States, but at the same time, there were also coalition forces and individuals who they would contract who were either local, so Iraqis, or people who are from partner states that were ultimately connected with the party of political conflict as such directly. Okay, that's essential. So Blackwater 4 passed with all freaking green flags, right? E is not a member of the armed forces of a party to the conflict. So a mercenary, they're operating under their own band. For those of you who don't know, in the Renaissance Italy, there would be basically roving bands of brigands who you could contract for a period of time, and they would operate in a military capacity, and they were called condottieri, right? Condottieri, right? So this means contractor. However, the contractors of back then and the contractors of today were very different. And of course, back then, the quality and fidelity and the honorable qualities that the commanders of such brigands, quote unquote, were varied, more varied than today, right? But today there is a very specific black and white situation, right? So you either are, let's say, associated or you're not. You're a mercenary or a PMC. And it's very clear that a lot of these PMC forces had previously been part of the armed forces of the party. So, for instance, the United States leverages Blackwater, who had a number of individuals on hand who were veterans of the conventional forces of the United States. To say nothing, of course, of partner countries, but it's important that you understand that these are not guys that are just being trained up from nothing within and who are only loyal to very specific organization and will sell their sword both ways anyway, right? So, again, Blackwater, good. And finally, has not been sent by a state, which is not a party to the conflict on official duty, as a member of its armed forces. So, obviously, this is where the interesting thing comes in. Like I said before, DPRK sends soldiers to Russia, even though it's not directly involved with that conflict, then it constitutes a mercenary force. Of course, Blackwater passes that because they're Americans, an American firm in an American-led mission, Operation Enduring Freedom, war in Iraq against terrorism. So in all these facets, they do not meet the qualification in any sense of a mercenary force. And it's absolutely essential that you know this, because mercenaries can be a nasty group of people. They can be sellswords, but in the worst way. In fact, many of ISIS and Islamic, let's say, insurgents were, in effect, mercenaries, paid gold for specific objectives, who were not themselves party to the conflict. They were simply swords for hire, or AK-47s for hire, rifles for hire, and operated in an offensive way from third-party countries, etc. So, full circle here. Now that I have disproven to you or elucidated to you the role of Blackwater or similar organizations, it's important that you understand this because it gives context to what I'm going to say next. The war in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere that we don't know of couldn't be possible without Erik Prince. And I say that unreservedly. Why do I say this? Well, because effectively, especially when they got their start in Iraq and were given this big contract, right? This was before when Erik Prince, scraped out of the North Carolina mud, right? The Blackwater that came up seeping from the soil. And with his own freaking balls and determination, effectively made a private military security contracting firm from scratch on his own. Basically, his big break was for the State Department and to give private military contracting security for HVTs, right? So high-value targets or whatever it may be called. For instance, the diplomats, all the USG State Department assets who were making, obviously, governance, who were temporarily in charge of governance locally in Iraq or helping set up the transition government and so on and so forth. Basically, what happens after a military occupation, right? Because for those legionaries who don't know, you don't just show up with guns blazing and that's all that happens. What you need to do is start setting roots, start reconstituting things, especially when it came to Iraq, because in 2003, we invaded, but also we engaged in what is called de-Baathification. And this was largely, to give you a historical background, this was largely based on our experience in Germany after World War II. And this idea of basically firing everyone who was associated with the previous regime, so that way we were able to make sure that those representatives in government who succeeded them were in no way going to fall back to the regime that we had purposefully gone to interdict. Now this is a challenge, because as we saw, the majority of the Iraqi state was contracting a highly competent force. So individuals who served in the army, the government, the Republican Guard, the intelligence services, the police, many of them were card-carrying Baathists. But for you to understand why this sounds like a non-measure is because ultimately it was like the Soviet Union back then, like that is Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Everyone was part of the Baathist party to get jobs. I mean, they weren't there because the majority were true believers. The majority were there because of personal benefits, and that's how they secured for themselves a personal career progression in their country. And obviously that got turned on its head. But what happens when you structurally unemploy people? That is, when you bar them from government or military service or any other kind of service which they're used to, right? Because remember, these men, especially if they spend 10, 20 years in the military, they have no other skills. Their skills are warfare. And if you bar them from the only form in which they can be employed, well, first, two things. It's unlikely that they'll transition into another career field. It might be impossible, especially in a war-torn country where there are no rehabilitation, quote-unquote, career centers to give people skills. And to say nothing, of course, is when you're part of that caste, that ruling caste of men, the highest rankings of class, right? So these men were from the warrior class, the political class. When you once govern a country, you'd rather die as opposed to step down, and that's exactly what happened. You saw shortly after 2003 the accumulation or the prominence of insurgencies, and it was multifaceted, right? You had Sunni extremists in the form of Al-Qaeda. You had Shiite extremists, which most of you don't know. Iraq is actually a majority Shiite country, which means that it is majority influenced by Iranian proxy forces. So obviously we were talking just recently, I gave you a quote from an experience from that rooftop. Well, that Mahdi, that specific individual, was from the Shiite sect in the south. And then, of course, you had Baathist holdouts. For those of you who don't know, Baathism is a rough amalgamation of Marxism and nationalism. It's an idea of a pan-Arabism. It's a nationalism that you probably ascribe to fascism, but it's also has very strong Marxist overtones and so on. So they're very secular, right? They are religious in a secular way, as a kind of incidental thing, right? Because Baathists are fundamentally, primarily irreligious, or areligious. They're secularists, right? And this is the wave that took over the Arab world by storm in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and of course tapered off, especially after the failed Yom Kippur War of 1973 and the disunion of Syria and Egypt. Most people don't know this, but actually briefly, for a very brief moment in time, there was a union between Syria and Egypt as part of this Pan-Arab League. But I get ahead of myself. What I'm trying to tell you, Legionary, is this, is that effectively, when you are ham-fisted and vindictive, when you're a poor conqueror, when you don't make friends out of your defeated foe, what you do is impel an insurgency. And it is a considered fact, or rather a lifelong volition of mine, that we don't learn counterinsurgency. What you learn is government, rather how to rule men, right? And Henry Kissinger is an exceptional figure because what he's able to do is completely approach a political situation amorally. And for you who are listening, you're like, oh, that's caustic, that's bad. Well, it's not bad, because when you go to other countries, they have different customs, traditions, political opinions, and embedded, ingrained ways of thought. Their economy is built and structured a certain way, and you can't accept or expect Dr. Seuss land overnight, right? And this is what the State Department, which is absolutely chock full of pinkos and communists, they believe that human nature is changeable on the drop of a dime, even though, of course, at base, and everyone has known this, that at base, foundationally, we have at least 65% of us is encoded hard in nature, right? Human nature is nature, right? The Greeks would call this physis, and very little of that is the nomos, right? And the Soviets made the exact same mistake when they invaded Afghanistan, which is why they incurred upon themselves a protracted insurgency. Beyond, of course, American funding, but remember, there was a genuine and organic basis, strong resentment towards the communist government of Afghanistan. Most of you don't know that. But what does this have to do with Erik Prince? What does this have to do with private military contractors and the United States? Well, it sets the stage. It sets the stage for what Iraq was. It was an artificially induced hellhole, purposely made by incompetent, ham-fisted communist bureaucrats who wanted to impose their way of life on someone else who was not willing to accept it, who was humiliated, and were given no economic options, and thus no recourse or incentive to succumb. When Alexander the Great defeated a foe, he didn't merely defeat them on the battlefield, but when he set siege to a city, he made an offering in which, if they supplicated or succumbed to his occupation, that he would enfranchise them and make him part of the empire. When the United States arrived in Iraq, we did the opposite. Not only did we beat them and humiliated them, there was actually a positive reaction. Iraqis, at first, during the invasion, were extremely, extremely grateful. And they were like, okay, thank you, Yankee. Now bugger off. Like, I appreciate it. Thanks for the solid. And we could have left it that way. Because I think what you need to understand about princes and sovereigns and countries and states is that all you have to do is change the sovereign. And maybe the sovereign can be different. We may disagree with how it is that they organize their country or what political philosophy or whatever crap it may be that they believe. However, if you change the leadership, you effectively change the character of that regime. We could have achieved our strategic goals of making sure that those WMDs, those chemical WMDs, were first of all seized and disposed of, that Saddam Hussein, who was an international sponsor of terror, which is true, was obviously overthrown and replaced. However, we did this second mistake, is make it a pervasive issue, which is over, I think it was like nearly 2/3 of the country were affected negatively economically, and a third was unemployed due to these de-Baathification policies. And of course, this causes insurgency, and it causes this problem which Erik Prince met head-on, which is the United States government wanted to impose a government and a provisional government. To do that, you needed State Department officials who were working as the civil bureaucracy to help tutor and raise democratic, quote-unquote, elections and so, basically to restabilize the country and instill a new constitution with a new philosophy and so on, to basically spread democracy, right? And this is the problem, that people were rejecting that invasive attack by the State Department. And so this insurgency claimed many, many lives. And it's not just Americans that died, but Iraqis too. And the instability that it caused lasted for decades. And remember, this instability is what caused ISIS, because ISIS didn't exist prior to this. Say what you want about Saddam Hussein, but he kept a strong clamp on any kind of that BS religious extremism and made sure they went to prison. But what happened was we, A, destroyed their government, and B, tried to install an extremely unpopular government buttressed by values which are extremely unpopular even here in the United States. For instance, the normalization of paraphilia, the destruction of the family by what they called enfranchisement, but what it really is ultimately the the destruction of the family unit of females and so on. But I get carried away. And why do I say this? Because in light of this conflict caused artificially, that the PMCs had to step in. The State Department had no protection. And the reason why they needed protection was because they were installing these policies which are extremely unpopular, which no one wanted. On top of everything else, they insisted on doing the following, which is to snub their noses in the faces of not simply the bad insurgents, who are obviously almost like ISIS precursors, but also natural Iraqi patriots. So there are normal dudes on the other side too. You have to understand that. If you're a legionary, you have to understand that the enemy isn't this fangled tooth demon troll. Not everyone is like that. Most people are normal, and most normal people do the right thing, which is defend our country. But what I'm trying to tell you is that it was at this challenge that Erik Prince made his name and made his company from the ground up and rose to the occasion. This is the moment that Blackwater really made it, and I think Mr. Prince does a better job of encapsulating the circumstances of events in which, and let me just read it to you. It's a little bit lengthy, but I think it's worth it, so that way I can give you further context and follow-on instructions as far as what the contracting world is concerned, pricing, and all these other efficiency questions, which Mr. Prince is doing an immense service, which goes underrepresented and underacclaimed. So, without further ado, let me read here with the quote. 3 months after the battle in Najaf, the Coalition Provisional Authority disbanded with the handover of power, and the United States established diplomatic relations with a newly sovereign Iraq. Under United States Resolution 1546, federal power in the powder keg of a country passed to a temporary Prime Minister Ayad Alawi and his interim Iraqi government. Their main job was to ensure that a democratic national election in which Iraqis would vote for a national assembly would then select a prime minister, a president, and cabinet as held no later than January 2005. With the transition, the key American figure in Baghdad was no longer Paul Bremer, but 64-year-old John D. Negroponte, the next appointed U.S. ambassador to Iraq. The veteran diplomat was responsible for overseeing a new U.S. embassy established in Saddam Hussein's former presidential palace in the Green Zone. The embassy was to be staffed by approximately 1,000 Americans reporting to nearly a dozen government agencies, including the Department of State, Defense, Agriculture, Commerce, and Homeland Security, as well as USAID and others. The crucial question was how to keep Americans safe. The core of the Green Zone, including the presidential palace, was surrounded by blast-proof concrete barricades, razor wire, and a raft of guarded checkpoints. But the State Department's job can't be conducted by 1,000 people hunkered behind sandbags, as a former U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Edward L. Peck, put it. Indeed, at the time, the United States transitioned to a bilateral relationship with the Iraqi government. Americans had overseen the creation, training, and advisement of 18 governorate councils, 90 district councils, 195 city councils, 445 neighborhood councils, and more than a dozen national ministries across the country, according to then Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage. There was much coordination to be done outside the protection of the Emerald City, as some called the Green Zone, and no one at the embassy needed to be reminded of how dangerous a place Iraq was at that point. The overall size of the active enemy forces in the country at the time, according to the U.S. Central Command, was approximately 20,000 men. Roughly 10,000 former regime members, about 3,000 members of al-Sadr's Shia militia, some 1,000 Sunni terrorist network overseen by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and about 5,000 criminals, religious extremists, and other rogue elements. Like I said, mercenaries from before. But I read again. Only 6 weeks prior to the opening of the United States Embassy, Izzat Salim, the president of the Iraqi Governing Council, was killed when a suicide bomber pulled his car up next to Salim's convoy, then detonated a bomb so powerful it melted the roadway. The attack, engineered to magnify its shock value, unfolded at a checkpoint to enter the Green Zone. Moreover, another crucial transition was taking place inside the Green Zone. Under DoD policy in Iraq, the military would provide security only to those contractors and government civilians deploying with the combat force or otherwise directly supporting the military's mission. Barring any special arrangements, other U.S. government agencies, including the United States State Department, had to provide their own security. And as much cobbled together, a diplomatic outpost on short notice is pretty standard for the department, ensuring safety for the sheer number of diplomats and associated personnel would soon be funneled into Baghdad was a different logistical challenge. To accomplish that task, State had long had an official Bureau of Diplomatic Security, known as DS or DipSec. That bureau develops and implements effective security programs to safeguard all personnel who work in every U.S. diplomatic mission around the world. According to its stated mission, it's an extraordinary responsibility vital to our country's development and humanitarian work abroad, and for establishing the stability in war-torn regions that allows American troops to come home. But there were only about 1,000 special agents in DipSec in 2005, and nearly 300 State Department missions worldwide. Those numbers could not line up in any sort of practical way, something State had long recognized. Starting in 1983, after the U.S. Embassy bombing in Beirut, Lebanon, the State Department resorted to using contractors to provide perimeter security to U.S. diplomatic and consular posts around the world. I'm going to skip forward a little bit in the text, but let me go ahead and start reading here. The State Department's Bureau of Diplomatic Security first used PSCs in 1994 when MVM Incorporated was hired to help protect Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide as he returned to Haiti. This was followed with the use of PSCs in Bosnia, Israel, Afghanistan, and most recently, Iraq. I saw it firsthand while serving in both Haiti and Bosnia as a SEAL. And this is, by the way, this is back to Prince now. He's reading. With contractors, State didn't need to spend some 3 years recruiting, vetting, training a DipSec agent. And they didn't have to add those men to long-term payroll or offer them pensions. The contractors were disposable security, single-use guards hired for a particular mission, and then let go when the work was done. And remember, this is what I was talking about earlier, is basically there is a smaller contract time. But I get carried away, and let me just start rereading again. As a defense employee of the government, I had welcomed the development, and I was thrilled to contribute to state security now. In 2000, the State Department had formalized an exclusive deal with the contractor DynCorp, to protect its diplomats in parts of the former Yugoslavia, the Palestinian territories, and Afghanistan. That contract was known as Worldwide Personal Protective Services, or WPPS. In mid-2004, State added additional responsibilities under the WPPS to cover security for Ambassador Negroponte and other personnel at the massive new embassy Baghdad. But DynCorp was unable to meet the expansive new task order. Suddenly, State was faced with the untenable prospect of sending waves of diplomats into Baghdad without the means to keep them safe. Those of us at Blackwater, meanwhile, had just wrapped up the successful Bremer detail. We had the personnel, vehicles, and protection strategies necessary for a larger operation, already sitting right there in the green zone. We had become known for getting results, and for delivering without cost overruns or excuses. So once again, the U.S. government found itself with an urgent and compelling problem that my company was uniquely positioned to solve. We were eager to help. In June 2004, the State Department issued Blackwater a 1-year sole source security contract under the WPPS, which provided Embassy Baghdad and its personnel with the immediate security they needed. It also allowed State a window of time to create a competitive contract for the Baghdad work, which would be bid upon by various contractors in the summer of 2005. So, again, it's not some backdoor deal. This is a competitive, market-efficacious contract that Blackwater and Mr. Prince landed. Anyway, back to the text. That indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity deal we signed was to provide for the protection of U.S. and or certain foreign government high-level officials whenever the need arises. That Baghdad task order, ultimately worth $488 million, launched Blackwater's lucrative, tumultuous, successful, and ultimately devastating relationship with the State Department. Over the next few years, new iterations of the WPPS would pay my company the better part of $1 billion and put nearly 1,000 of our contractors, effectively a private regiment, on the ground in Iraq at any one time. But that hardly means things always went smoothly, and thanks to dramatic misunderstandings among the general public about the scope of that deal and the regulations governing contractor actions in Iraq, Blackwater quickly became the lightning rod for critics of the war effort. Our work fulfilling the WPPS brought my company unprecedented importance and visibility, and then ultimately destroyed it. End quote. And I think in reference to the misunderstandings in the text that Mr. Prince so generously, kind of tactfully looked over, I think it's important that you understand that these misgivings were cultivated purposefully by not simply your usual communist, pinko fifth columnist suspects, but more disingenuously and more problematically, government functionaries and bureaucrats, people who would otherwise, in circumstances that their job didn't ride on, effectively they would not have blamed Blackwater, and that they had an interest in dumping responsibility on the whipping boy, so to speak, right? So basically, what ended up happening was, and this is a recurring theme, and we saw this in the Najaf, and we see this continuously over time, and unfortunately Blackwater would go into a series of litigation, which was ultimately cultivated by not simply subversive elements in the United States, but also aided and abetted by elements within the State Department and bureaucrats, because it was a way of covering their failures and ultimately protecting their six, right? And because of the fact that there's a perception that these are mercenaries, and America doesn't have, well, at least since the 1965 cultural pinko revolution, it hasn't had a martial self-consciousness. On top of the fact there was by that time, cultural hysteria against the war in Iraq, which of course I think everyone agrees that it was a mistake. Strategically speaking, we lost both conflicts, both in Iraq, because it became roughly a proxy of Iran, a failed state and a destabilizer of the region and globally, with the making of ISIS, of course, being one of the flagship events of that war, which again has nothing to do with Erik Prince and has everything to do with the State Department and Bush and the Uniparty. But on top of everything else, but Afghanistan also failed as well. I mean, it began as a Taliban Islamic Emirate, and it ended as the Taliban Islamic Emirate. So ultimately, strategically speaking, we're losing, right? It's in this background, against this background of cultural flurry and frustration and failure, to say nothing, of course, of the rapacity of other security contractors who were doing such a thing as Cost+Rate, right? Which, long story short, is effectively you get a contract, the government reimburses you for the cost of materials and doing the job, plus an added bonus, so plus an added rate. And there is no cap to that, right? So that contract, the parameters of that contract is that there is simply no roof to the expenses, which leads to the runaway costs that we have seen and has gotten us in what I think it's like trillions of dollars in debt. But let's start with a happening. A tragedy. A tragedy leveraged by the most malign and avaricious elements the United States has yet to offer since Gordon Gekko, who, through their caprice and lack of integrity, leveraged the pain and mourning of others for their own personal gain. And what I'm referencing right now is the 2004 Fallujah ambush, where 4 American contractors were assassinated cruelly in Fallujah on a logistical mission. Right? What were the contents of this mission? They were merely transporting necessary equipment, cooking equipment, I believe, something as menial as that, as simple as that, through the city at Fallujah, getting after it, and ultimately under enemy fire in an ambush where they weren't even given the chance to return fire in self-defense. They were killed and barbarically hung upside down on the Fallujah Bridge, burned alive, and women and children and men stomped on their corpses in an attempted humiliation of our heroes. And incidentally, I think it's important that you understand, Legionaries, this transmission, this is who it's dedicated to. Those heroes I remember seeing on the news, but these are their names. Scott Halverson, Jerry Zovko, Wesley Badalona, and Mike Teague. All heroes. All Americans. All citizens. Fallen in the line of duty, it was the deaths of these patriots which ultimately changed history. Every warrior knows that to do one's duty is to go onto the battlefield or into one's job knowing he is already dead. And we do our utmost. We do our utmost to keep our guys alive and make sure they're well. But this is part of the journey. And to fall on the battlefield is a great honor. And of course, not ideal. Why do I say this? Well, this is when the vultures started circling. And they were certainly no Iraqi carrion. They were, in fact, American. Americans who thought they could exploit this tragedy in the furtherance of our freedom and security to aggrandize themselves, to blackmail through perfidy, legally, Mr. Prince and all the patriots who were under his organization, and ultimately created a circumstance in which were emotionally manipulated by a cretinous lawyer to seek litigation for punitive damages against Mr. Prince. And of course, I doubt that these individuals were looking for, I'm not going to mention their names, because frankly, we know their grief. And Mr. Prince went above and beyond to give them proper honors, to console the families, to make sure they're okay. And at first they were. But this pernicious actor ultimately took advantage of how they felt and the tragic loss of their children to make a quick buck. And what's worse, in civil court as opposed to criminal court, it's only sufficient or necessary for preponderance of evidence. And evidence, much was swayed by social media, by effectively the news cycle. And this individual leveraged, in bad faith, the frustrations that were going over the war, the tragedy of the parents of these individuals, as well as the negative perception PMCs have started to connote with a targeted propaganda machine which was designed to destroy the American war effort and the American Republic. And at the crux of all these forces, Mr. Prince found himself fending off a multi-headed hydra. Public perception, communist perfidy, bureaucratic nonsense, in addition to, of course, the elements which are malignant and have far-reaching malevolent effects on the wider republic as a whole. Of course, speculative and bad faith lawyering, bad faith private military contracting, which is cost plus fixed rate, or rate, whatever it may be, which has impoverished the United States, made us less secure, made us less free, whether it be the Patriot Act or, of course, the prevalence of malicious litigation suits leveled against our best elements, the best of us, because that is who Blackwater was and continues to be in my heart. The best of us. Because remember, what is the PMC? What is Blackwater? They are veterans. They've served honorably, achieved high ranks, and have chosen in their time to continue to serve their country. And for those of you who are laughing, who think that's a little bit much, it's a little bit silly, remember that every time that he swore in functionaries or employees into Blackwater and their employ, they all recited the oath. It's not necessarily an enlistment oath or an officer's appointment oath, but it is an oath nonetheless, the American Constitution and its interests. Each and every one of the employees, private military contractors working for the Blackwater company or firm, were American patriots and serving constantly to further and champion the American Republic, whether they were exploits in Iraq or flying very low in the Pashtun passes, mountain passes of the Himalayas, in the middle of the night dropping much-needed aid into forward operating bases, like Operating Base Tillman, where pilots and Mr. Prince himself risked life and limb numerous times to further the American war effort and fight for freedom. To make sure when soldiers were cut off and had no supply and were forward positioned in such a place that the enemy was almost overwhelming them, that they were always there to support them and to save them, rescue them. When Katrina happened, Mr. Prince, immediately, without being asked, rose to the occasion as well, again and again, to support the American citizens, to guarantee them safety, to further the United States government's interests, both domestically and abroad. To say nothing, of course, of the various exploits he has yet to mention to us, because he is under contract by the CIA with a non-disclosure act that can't tell us of the full extent of his efforts or initiatives which have made us safer and better at home. It is because of visionaries like Prince that we owe so much. And I'm not just saying that because he was my personal hero. I mean, ever since I was a boy, he was my personal hero, but I say this knowing the facts. And if you read his book, he's more than willing to show you the mistakes he's made, and that he's just a man at the end of the day. He's not a god. He doesn't pretend to be. He's not a megalomaniacal freak. Quite the contrary. He's America's first citizen. Princeps. Prince. But what does that mean? Citizenship. It means leadership. It means holding oneself to a set moral code, to step up when no one will. Mr. Prince did this when he was a kid on the Great Lakes of Michigan, saving a woman in a time, an accident, maritime accident of explosion, and he continues to do it today, all the way through. As a continuous habit of excellence, he has dedicated himself. But at the end of the day, why is it that I'm championing his cause? Why is it that I am talking about his life? Well, Legionary, it's for you. The idea is this. Mr. Prince is just a man, but he made himself a leader and a warrior and a champion of the Republic via one foundational value, that it's our responsibility. It's our responsibility to take care of our family, to take care of our community, to take care of our subordinates and our leaders, to take care of our progeny, and for their well-being, to ultimately not seek selfish aggrandizement, but to give oneself selflessly, right? And this is a current that keeps on getting lost in the West, and if you think the reasons for the West's failures today, or why things are so bad, why is it that we have foreigners and communists in our governments maligning the very citizens of the polis that we inhabit? Well, the reason why is because good men fail to take power. Good men fail to go out in their community and do what's right. In many ways, the reason for this is because it has been systematically enforced from above and discouraged in many ways. All the institutions which leverage and leaven the citizen body to make the individual better have been subverted. Those that have not been subverted have been done away with. The culture, too, has become worse. Whether it's the prevalence of paraphilia, the destruction of the family unit, the increased impoverishment of the American citizenry in the Republic, the incipient crime which is rising, or the dereliction of politicians and bureaucrats. The problems are endless, but the remedies are one and universal. This sounds strange, but the truth is that when you, legionary, choose to master yourself, to be a leader yourself, to be a citizen yourself, and thereby your direct involvement or the example that you set, you start to change the Republic as a whole. You start aggregating our collective efforts upwards and onwards. This was the strength of our early Republic, because though it may be the case that some think that modes of government, even if beasts inherit them, that somehow we have a paradise, that couldn't be further from the truth. The truth is that ultimately every individual has a choice. Every individual has agency. Agency to choose whether one is decadent, weak, pathetic, and a drain on everyone around them, or if we choose to better ourselves and better our communities, to be selfless, and to labor for the tree whose shade we'll never enjoy. The delineating factor between countries, and I've lived in a few myself, aside from the United States, what helps individuals become great, or a society or republic to become great, is the active choice for ordinary men to dare and pursue extraordinary tasks. Now, I don't think Mr. Prince thinks of himself as a great man, though he is. And even those who malign him must reluctantly cede the point. However, I think what makes him great is his inborn character and his self-discipline and self-imposed agency in which he expects the best of himself to be the man both for his family and for his country. And that ultimately, in mastering himself, he became a man amongst men. That is like the Romans had this term, right? There was the homo, and then there was the vir. And he became virile precisely because he always chose the right thing over the expedient thing. Remember, he went to the Naval Academy, right? And he didn't drop out. He tendered his resignation because the values being espoused at the Naval Academy did not synergize with the ultimate good, with the good of the Republic, with what is right for man and woman, what is right for a nation. And we can see the rot in these institutions today. For instance, there's that communist that it took senatorial attention for him to get kicked out, but a communist, literally, that Rapone guy at West Point, or to say nothing, of course, of all the ilk that comes out of the Naval Academy today, and so on. But he chose the hard way. He forcibly went to an institution that resonated and was up to the moral and righteous standard that he expected of himself, first of all. Further, he could have easily, like I said, rested on the laurels of his father. He could have easily just sat back and did nothing. But he didn't. He went out and chose to dedicate himself to something bigger than himself. He took up the challenge of defending his country by seeking out the Navy SEALs, by being an officer in the Navy SEALs, by continuing on and serving faithfully in a republic when this republic ostensibly didn't need his services. He fostered them anyway. And when, unfortunately, the senior Mr. Prince passed away, he rose to the occasion as well. and fulfilled his filial duties to his family, and administered the firms under his power and control well, and expanded on it. So what is that to say? He is the man that was constantly giving more than he took. He made his own name. He made his own effort. He was a man of integrity when everything was set against him to not be. Remember that wealth corrodes. Many of you wouldn't be able to handle billions of dollars. You would sink yourself into a stupor if you were given that kind of resource with no kind of moral tether. Not Mr. Prince. What Mr. Prince ended up doing was above and beyond. And he chose to take a risk and held himself with integrity when he was contracting with the government. And he had the opportunity to do the same grift, avaricious, disgusting crap that these war profiteers do. He chose to be a man which would afford his services and further the American Republic in its efforts and enterprises abroad at a better rate, at a discounted rate, or rather comparative, but actually one with integrity, one which he was holding himself to and saving us, the taxpayer, money, which is to say, the citizen, money, because he was looking out for our interest. He was a good steward of his resources and of those who had entrusted in him the power of life and death, the wealth and security of their employment. Because remember, as a sole proprietor, he wasn't just doing things for himself. Had his business gone under, he would have been unfortunately causing the unemployment of many thousands. And so he took that responsibility. He sought responsibility and he took it. And finally, when he went through the crucible, which was the Iraq War, and the idiocy of that conflict, of course, was not his fault. The idiocy of that conflict belongs to the neocons, and it belongs to the neolibs, the Uni Party, right? Because remember, Bush is more than happy to endorse the other side in the face of a patriotic faction, right? They have no problem with that, but remember that it is that very faction that caused the deaths of thousands of our American citizens, to say nothing of 3 million civilians, both Iraqi and otherwise, dead for their own well-being. They were the ones who caused ISIS. They are the ones who impoverished an entire region. They are the ones who are causing the downfall of all of Western civilization due to their negligence and his petty greed. I keep on saying this, but this is a recurring theme. When he stood to gain by following with the herd, following in line, being just like everyone else, taking cuts where he didn't deserve, taking no risks when he could have rested on laurels, taking positive action when his own country had a natural disaster such as Katrina, and taking risks which went above and beyond what a regular businessman would normally do. For instance, he leveraged his personal resources in which he used his little birds, his pilots, to go and rescue wounded troops in the battlefield in Iraq. He did that at his own risk, beyond simply the insurance that was given, that was trying to gouge him for prices. He held himself with good rapport and bearing in the face of salacious attacks by both the commie media and with people who have a personal gripe, or lesser men who won't hold themselves to a higher standard. And there's a certain general who I won't name the name, but this individual had very much one thing to say when Mr. Prince saved his ass, and had a very different thing to say after the case had been where, well, let's just say he was over-leveraged morally, okay? I hope you legionaries understand that this transmission is not meant as a way to malign negative forces. In fact, it is to draw attention to the background, to the norm, the negative norm. And amid this normality, quote unquote, there sits a paragon of virtue and excellence, a man. When we read history, we look at individuals like Caesar, or Alexander the Great, or any myriad other archetypes in which we can admire and start to reflect on. But this kind of historicity, this kind of classicism, which pervades, or really doesn't pervade anymore because of the way that the education has changed, but maybe our ancestors, they were brought up on Plutarch and so on. There's this mistake to think that humanity has changed. It's changed so much, and technology has somehow changed so much that the human condition itself has changed as well. And therefore, being able to personify or to enflesh the acts of yore into today is impossible, right? We think that somehow the values that they held then were a reflection of the technologies and circumstances of them, as opposed to the fact that those formations and values and stories were just like men like Prince. Men who were facing long odds, who were given an out, who were given the opportunity to choose cowardice or to choose not to step up to the plate in the initiative of a citizen. No one would have faulted them for being less, and still they chose to be more than themselves. I speak about Erik Prince precisely because he is someone in the modern day who we can admire and model our own lives after, who we can use as a talisman, maybe even as an archetype, beyond simply the man himself, but the courage and the vision it takes to be who he is. Because all these things, just as Nietzsche said, the whole of civilization can be changed with 300 men or less, so long as they are dedicated and each are 10,000, right? There's that quote by Heraclitus that one man is 10,000 if he is best. Well, men like Erik Prince are 1 million. And they can do whatever they want with Erik Prince, the person, the flesh, right? Because as you can see, he was completely undercut and betrayed by the very republic which had, for so long, rendered so many benefits from him. And we can probably speculate as to the why, but we know for a fact that he was indispensable in many ways for a period of more than a generation, and continues to be so. And yet, in this republic, he's only punished for what he's able to do for us. And it's unfortunate, because in republics in which we are not able to reward the best citizens, the best amongst us, if we're not even able to affirm what are the values which lead to good citizens such as Prince, how are we going to stand writ large when the average man is not looking at men like Prince, but they're looking at people shaking their ass on TV, or the unfaithful, or the deformed, and those who seek to deform others? Basically, the cretins of the world have come to roost. How long can we stand? How long can we sit by and let not simply evil, but doom approach? Political power is one of those things which in and of itself is not a good or a bad. It's a means. And many of you, I understand, are loath to take power because you think it's beyond yourself, and when you conceive of it, it comes from the perspective of a sovereign. But Prince is a great example of the way that an individual, a citizen, can be a good father, can be a good community leader, can be a good maybe governor or a statesman, some kind of person that helps in the way that they can help with what they have. To cite Plato, it goes the following: "The price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men." And as we see now in a republic, we are ruled by evil men. I have many friends who have lost for their friends in the atrocious wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. Now, these were heroes, of course, and it wasn't in vain per se. As we know, the fight in and of itself is its own self-overcoming, and it is laudable. However, how much better would it have been had we sent these warriors in a war which benefited, for instance, the United States, truly advanced the cause of justice? And justice, of course, is not necessarily what you think it is, which is your petty political volitions, but rather the affirmation of the traditions of those people whom you have stewardship over. right? It's a responsibility. So the question remains to us, we citizens of the United States, we patriots of the West, and champions of all that is good and right in the world. What is one to do? No matter how humble one may be, what can we do? We don't usually have all the power that the entrenched bureaucrats have, but we do have something that superimposes anything that comes as a competitor in conflict. What I say to you is this, and it's to follow in the footsteps of great men, because just as Machiavelli would say, great men, though you may not pursue to the destination that they achieved, you may take on heirs and benefit from the paths that they took. And so from Erik Prince, we're able to learn the following: how it is that we can become involved, how can we exercise our agency, to what end does excellence matter, because excellence matters, right? Integrity matters. But also beyond a moral scope, and I don't mean this petty moralism, I mean the morals of ends, right? Not means, but ends. And these ends, of course, are what benefits the Republic and the Patria as a whole, and what ultimately vanquishes the enemy. But further, how are you an asset to your team? How are you an asset to your home country? How are you an asset to your family? And so on and so forth. Those answers are specific to yourselves. Obviously, not all of us have the same skill set or natural dispositions, but we can all be excellent in the small, because excellence in the small becomes greatness in the great. But without further ado, I think I get a little bit too far, because the chronicle of Erik Prince hasn't finished. And at the time of his book being released in 2013, it seemed like things were kind of tough. I'll be real with you. Things were probably kind of tough, especially for Mr. Prince, and the agony which he had to face, the injustice, indignation, and frankly, it was a very petty and underhanded, disgusting thing they did it to him. By going after him as a whipping boy, as a fall guy, no matter how faithfully he served, no matter how much he chose the high road, the difficult road, the road which led to less material riches, but invigorated his soul and reflected well on his subordinates and as Americans as a whole, right? So ultimately, this guy was ultimately portrayed in so many ways, which I won't get into here, and he wasn't even able to get into in the book, because a lot of his contracts with the CIA, which is basically, for those of you who don't know, the CIA is the foreign intelligence agency who is responsible for not simply the open-ended and in the open state governance type initiatives, but also the things that are not recorded. And suffice it to say that when you run in the high rungs of governance or high rings of power, you do a lot of things and rub shoulders and elbows and collaborate on projects and are in the know of things which most people are not. And so, for instance, when we were rooting out Al-Qaeda and when we killed and liquidated Osama bin Laden, this is, by the way, my conjecture, and this is not anything that has been disclosed to me or anything, but I would highly suspect that Blackwater was an integral part to logistically and paramilitarily supporting missions which led to that ultimate victory. And so you have to understand that what he reveals to the world and what is known to the world about Blackwater, about Mr. Prince, is really only the tip of the iceberg. And that tip of the iceberg has been so completely maligned by the same actors who are the ones who took down Blackwater. And it is a tragedy. Frankly, it's a tragedy. And he writes here in the book, and I wanted to read this last passage, and it says this: "The brand name, however, lives on. As part of the sale of my company," and by the way, he was compelled to sell his company. So, going back, I kept ownership of the Blackwater trademark and Bear Paw logo. It's a polarizing brand, I know, but it's still got a proud following in some quarters. The ultimate irony there is that as I look forward, it's possible I could actually build another training facility and explore more security work. I often hear from old friends who say, just do it again. Get the band back together and we'll make a new Blackwater. There will never stop being a demand for that expertise, but I don't know that I see it happening. That's got nothing to do with business, it's personal. The loss of my father rocked me. Then, after Joanne's death, I put emotional walls up that probably haven't ever fully come back down. Seeing the company I'd built torn down for no reason was almost too much to bear. The way that the Blackwater story ended still gnaws at me. I'm no hero. The world knows all too well of my own mistakes, but I was never meant to play the villain. I take some solace knowing that in the end, history will judge me and all we have accomplished at Blackwater. Perhaps children someday will read about us the way I read about cowboys and battling pirates on the high seas and Clara Chenol leading the Flying Tigers. Maybe someday people will grasp that Blackwater's legacy is far more than shootings, that it also includes the shelters we set up in Afghanistan to house orphans and widows driven from their homes. Maybe they'll understand that it is precisely my deep faith that made me insist on the building of mosques at our bases overseas so our neighbors would have a place to practice their own faith. Perhaps something in my journey will inspire a child in the heartland the way I'd been inspired, and he'll also dedicate his life to being a force for good in the world. End quote. Well, I address you right now, Mr. Prince. You have been. And look no further than myself and my friends. I actually was one of those kids that shared one of your experiences, and my condolences to Joanne, your late wife. I too had someone who suffered from and I taken care of with my family breast cancer and tragically passed away. And I understand the challenges which a man faces in such circumstances. Even as a young man myself, I understood what kind of toll that takes on a psyche. Further, I think it was because of your example that you showed the rest of us that there was a possibility for agency, especially in a world, in a civilization, or rather this strange bureaucratic Marxist idea of materialism where there is no agency, that we are only the hapless slaves of our environments. You showed us that by dedication to something above us, that is greater to us, more important than us, dedication to integrity, dedication to the military arts, and to patriotism in a meaningful way, that you've inspired tens of thousands of us, young men and women, who have risen to the occasion and followed in your footsteps. So, Mr. Prince, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you because that promise came true. And I see you now on the internet, and I see your actions in which you have reaffirmed that same life mission you have so faithfully clung to all your life. You are that man who I admired and saw as a hero as a young boy, and I hope, check that, I know I will be one of your foremost champions to make sure that your legacy and your example doesn't die. Because ultimately speaking, we are not ourselves. We are the archetype by which we live. Because no matter what they do to you, no matter how much they malign you, no matter what they may do to your personal being, and I hope, I'm not saying that as a strange threat or something like that, I'm saying that because I'm sure you know the strange world that you may have lived in, that if you get too out of line, things happen, right? Let's just leave it at that. Well, we know when we live with integrity, and a wise man lives for merit and the good, that we die with all the riches in the world within our hearts and our souls. It's your example among many, not to mention, of course, those heroes who died in Fallujah, or the many unnamed who still serve the United States out of uniform, and in that of your esteemed PMC, you serve us in so many ways, with far-reaching ramifications, which are unlikely, very unlikely, to see the light of day, precisely because the archives and the institutions by which those documents are kept secret likely don't want any positive reflections of you to be made come to light. Well, sir, you have found your champions, you have found your boys, so to speak, and your legions. Because ultimately speaking, it doesn't matter who is in the state, it doesn't matter who they say they are, a man is a man by his soul. And I can say proudly that I am an American patriot precisely because of you, and it is precisely because of you that we can effect that change writ large. So anyway, back to you, legionaries. You want to save the United States? Do you want to be a champion of Western civilization? Do you want to stand for what is good in the world? Follow Erik Prince's example. I'll link his book in the description below, but I'd highly recommend that you follow his social media. I'd highly recommend that you see how he comports himself. You know, in the Marine Corps, there are leadership traits, right? Justice, judgment, decisiveness, integrity, dependability, tact, initiative, enthusiasm, bearing, unselfishness, courage, knowledge, loyalty, and endurance, more than anything. Look at his life. See how much he has been the very incarnation of one of the heroes Plutarch writes about. The Parallel Lives, right? This book which saw the heroes of ancient Rome and compared them with that of ancient Hellenes for the purpose of judging moral virtues and vices and lessons we can deduce. However, all the men covered were all great men, and favored among them in my heart is Scaevola, the man who put his hand in the fire after being set in front of the Alban king after failing the assassination attempt which he had been charged to do by the Roman Senate to turn back the hostile foe, and with such ready determination and unselfishness and willingness to die, he put such fear into the foe that he caused a peace and saved Rome. Or better still, the Horatii brothers, who in selfless service put themselves in danger and almost snuffed out an entire family line in the name of something greater than themselves. Does this not sound like Mr. Prince? Does this not sound like his father? Does this not sound like maybe their progeny someday? God's willing? Or Cincinnatus, who in a time of crisis took up dictatorial powers which were rendered to him for a certain amount of time to set the balance of everything right, in which he rose to the occasion, finished everything, and then solemnly and in good faith, with integrity, put down his honors, returned power to the Republic, and returned to his farm? All these civic virtues you see in Erik Prince alive. And how true it is. Maybe it is just a touch of destiny. Maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But most of you don't know the etymology of prince. Prince comes from the Latin princeps, which means first citizen, right? And the first person to leverage this name, Augustus, Emperor Augustus, right? This is my favorite emperor personally. But the importance of this is that ultimately, and you can see it in his humble and honest demeanor with everyone he encounters, whether it's in social media, and what I would assume, because I don't personally know this guy, is his demeanor in private. He sees himself as basically a pure. And of course, what is the leader of men except for the pure, the first, the eldest brother? And I see that in him. And for those of you who think that those ancient spirits, which took through will to power alone the agency and the fates of civilizations in their own hands and rendered them immune from the fates and secured in their place their names in history. This is what we can do for America. Just like Rome, Rome was great because Romans loved her, not because she was great that Romans loved her. So too do we, you and I, patriot, you and I, citizen. So too do we love America, not because it is great, but because it is us. If the life of Erik Prince, and it continues to be, the chronicle is not closed. The fates have not finished the woven tapestry of his life. But if we can understand one very important thing, is that no matter what you choose, you will always face dangers, especially if you choose to take the high road. The high road is difficult. The high road is trying. The high road is precisely what I am trying to inspire in you in the Legion. It is precisely that where men are created. America and its republic has only fallen due to our dereliction. And I'm not the kind of man that likes pointing fingers, because at the end of the day, we take extreme ownership. We are men of a certain age. Many times in many centuries past, there have been many men who have died at a much younger age than we, and who have given themselves more selflessly, more virtuously than us. We have no one to blame but ourselves, and this is a good thing. Why? Because ultimately the solutions are within us, and the corollary charge must be, it should be, the constant self-betterment, self-strengthening, mentally, physically, spiritually, of every man, every citizen, to dedicate yourself totally to something bigger and more important than yourself, to do so unreservedly, unselfishly, humbly, and with such vigor and intensity that no enemy can withstand us and our will, that no friend, no citizen, no charge of ours ever find wanting in security and prosperity. And if you don't know how to achieve these ends, look no further for inspiration and a general guide than Erik Prince's life. And so, Legionary, remember this, that through persistence and determination, dedication to a higher cause, all things are possible. Further, I doubt this is the last chapter of Erik Prince, and it is by his example that legions of Erik Princes are being created as we speak, in furtherance of his cause. And even if it were the case that he no longer is that leader, in his mold, we continue the mission. And so, without further ado, this is Bruta, Historia, Sergeant Barnes, and General Lance. Until next time, signing off.